Demon Hunter's Quest. Can darkness be stopped? In the Demon Hunter's journey, a master and his apprentice find themselves caught in a terrifying, mystical town plagued by supernatural forces. As they stumble upon a marketplace for the dead, eerie encounters escalate their fear. Unbeknownst to them, they are walking straight into a trap set by a mysterious demon. A town full of suspicious behavior raises alarm bells for the duo, leading them to discover a twisted ritual being performed by a cunning Taoist master who manipulates the dead. With a background in sorcery and a network of minions, the Taoist controls a host of demonic entities, including the horrifying corpse walkers. As the master and his apprentice race against time, they must fight to uncover the Taoist's true intentions before more innocent lives are lost. The gripping tale unfolds in a series of terrifying encounters, culminating in a climactic battle within the heart of an ancient tomb where spirits and demons collide, their ultimate goal to rid the town of a demonic plague while exposing the Taoist's deadly plot to create a fearsome undead army. The stakes grow higher as the apprentice grapples with fear and doubt, but with his master's guidance, the two are thrust into a dangerous battle for their lives and the souls of the townsfolk. This journey is a powerful mix of suspense, emotion, and supernatural horror. Part 1. Arrival at Greenshade. Thomas and Ethan trudged through the overgrown park, the sun slowly sinking below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows over the landscape. The wind had picked up, howling through the dense trees that lined the dirt road, and every now and then a rustle in the bushes would make Ethan jump, his nerves frayed from the long journey. His boots were caked with mud, his cloak heavy with the weight of a day's worth of grime, and his mind clouded with exhaustion. Master Ethan called out, his voice weak from hours of silence. "How much further?" Thomas, walking just ahead, was silent for a moment. His tall, dark figure cut an imposing silhouette against the dying light. Without turning around, he answered, "Not far now. Just over the next hill." Ethan nodded, but couldn't shake the growing unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach. The forest seemed too quiet, too still, almost as if it were holding its breath. The thought of stopping for the night in such a desolate place sent a chill through him, and he quickened his pace to stay closer to his master. As they crested the hill, the town of Greenshade came into view, nestled in a valley surrounded by thick woods. At first glance, it seemed like any other small, rural village, modest wooden houses with smoke curling from their chimneys, narrow streets lined with the faint glow of lanterns. But something about it felt off. The atmosphere was wrong, almost too still. The village should have been a welcoming sight after their long trek, but instead it felt foreboding, like a place where the shadows clung too closely to the corners and the air itself was heavier than it should be. Ethan glanced at Thomas, hoping his master would say something reassuring. But Thomas's face was set in a frown, his eyes scanning the village below with a sharp intensity. He was a man of few words, but Ethan had learned over the years to read his moods. And this time, Thomas's silence spoke volumes. Something was wrong. "I don't like this place," Ethan muttered under his breath, but Thomas heard him. "We need shelter," Thomas replied, his voice low, as if not wanting to disturb the quiet around them. "We stay the night. It's too dangerous to continue without rest." "Dangerous?" The word lingered in Ethan's mind like a dark cloud. He swallowed his unease and followed Thomas down the narrow, winding path that led into the town. As they walked, the village seemed even stranger up close. The streets were deserted, not a soul in sight, though it was early evening. The houses were dark, the windows like empty eyes staring out at them. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his dagger, his fingers curling around the worn leather handle, a small comfort in the oppressive silence. "Where is everyone?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Inside, I suppose," Thomas replied, but there was a hint of doubt in his tone. They passed by a small market square, and it was here that Ethan first noticed something truly strange. In the middle of the square, where only moments before there had been nothing but cobblestone, now stood a market, a bustling, ghostly marketplace that had seemingly appeared out of thin air. Master. Ethan's voice trembled, his eyes wide as he stared at the scene before him. Thomas stopped, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight. The stalls were lined with goods, fruits, vegetables, meats, yet the colors were wrong. Everything was muted, as though drained of life, and the vendors. The vendors stood unnaturally still, their heads lowered, faces hidden beneath dark hoods. Their movements were slow, almost mechanical, and the air around them was thick with an unnatural chill. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. That wasn't there before. Was it? Thomas didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the market with a sharp, calculating gaze, every muscle in his body tense. No, he finally said, his voice cold. It wasn't as they stood there. The distant sounds of murmured voices began to fill the air, but the words were indistinguishable, just a low, haunting hum that made Ethan's skin crawl. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end as a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. Master Ethan whispered, "We should leave." But Thomas didn't move. His eyes were fixed on something at the far end of the market, where a group of figures had gathered. They were taller than the others, their forms more defined, though they remained just as still. One of them slowly lifted its head, and Ethan caught a glimpse of its face, or what should have been its face. Instead, there was nothing, just a hollow, gaping void where a face should have been. Ethan stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "What? What is that? Keep walking," Thomas ordered, his voice steely. "Don't look at them." Ethan's legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to move, staying close to his master. As they passed through the market, the voices grew louder, more insistent, as if they were calling out to him, reaching for him. His vision blurred for a moment, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. For just a second, Ethan thought he saw shapes moving in the darkness, figures darting between the stalls, watching them, following them. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to focus on Thomas's steady footsteps ahead of him. His heart pounded in his ears, each beat louder than the last, drowning out the whispers that clung to the air like a foul mist. "Don't look back," Thomas said again, his voice low but commanding. Ethan nodded, though every fiber of his being screamed at him to run. It took all his willpower to keep moving. His eyes locked on Thomas's back as they made their way through the unsettling, ghostly marketplace. He could still feel the weight of those empty, hollow faces behind him, watching, waiting. They finally reached the other side of the square, and Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was short-lived. As they turned down a narrow alley, he risked one last glance over his shoulder. The market was gone. Ethan blinked, his breath catching in his throat. The square was empty, completely deserted, as if the market had never existed. He stumbled, almost falling, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just seen. Or had he seen it at all? Was it a trick of the light, a figment of his exhausted imagination? Master Ethan's voice was barely a whisper, but Thomas didn't stop walking. He didn't even turn around. "We'll find answers soon," Thomas said, his tone grave. "But for now we need to be cautious. Stay close, and do not, under any circumstances, look back again." The weight of Thomas's words hung heavy in the air, and Ethan's blood ran cold. He had always trusted his master's judgment, but this time the fear in Thomas's voice was unmistakable. They continued down the alley, the darkness pressing in around them, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they had stepped into something far darker than they had ever encountered before. Something that wouldn't let them leave so easily. And somewhere in the back of his mind he could still hear the faint, haunting whispers of the ghostly market echoing in the silence. Part 2. The Mysterious Market. The night had deepened, shrouding the town of Greenshade in an oppressive, suffocating darkness. The moon hung low in the sky, veiled by thick clouds that moved sluggishly across the horizon, casting fleeting shadows on the narrow streets. Thomas and Ethan walked in silence, their footsteps echoing too loudly in the empty alleys. The air felt thick, heavy with an unnatural stillness that weighed down on their shoulders like an invisible shroud. The village, which had appeared unsettling upon their arrival, now seemed entirely abandoned. The houses they passed were dark, their windows like hollow, lifeless eyes, and not a single light flickered from inside. No warmth, no signs of life. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps, each one seeming to catch in his throat. Something was terribly wrong, but what? Thomas moved ahead, his stride steady but tense. He hadn't spoken since they had entered the heart of the town. His silence only heightened Ethan's unease, making the apprentice feel as though they were walking directly into the jaws of something ancient and terrible. He clutched the hilt of his dagger with white-knuckled determination, though the weapon felt utterly useless against the creeping sense of dread that tightened around him like a vice. And then they saw it, the market. It was sudden, unnatural, like stepping through a veil and finding themselves in a different world. One moment the street had been empty, and the next the town square was filled with stalls. The change was so abrupt that Ethan stumbled, blinking in disbelief. There was no explanation for how the market had appeared so suddenly, nor for why it felt so profoundly wrong. The stalls stood in uneven rows, their wood old and splintered, groaning under the weight of goods that looked wrong. Ethan's eyes darted from stall to stall, each one more grotesque than the last. The fruits piled in baskets were bruised, misshapen, some oozing with thick, dark fluids. There were vegetables too, but their skins were warped, covered in blackened spots that spread like rot. Meat hung from hooks, but the cuts were unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. Chunks of flesh that seemed to pulse as though still alive, riddled with strange veins that throbbed under the pale light of the moon. His stomach churned at the sight, and a wave of nausea rolled over him. Master, he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. What is this? Thomas didn't answer immediately. He stood still, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the marketplace, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The tension in his body was palpable, as if every muscle was wound tight, ready to spring into action. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, cautious. "Don't look too closely, Ethan. Just keep moving." But it was impossible not to look. Ethan's gaze was drawn to the figures that moved between the stalls, though moved wasn't quite the right word. The vendors, if that's what they were, stood stiffly behind their displays, their movements slow and mechanical. Their heads were bowed, faces obscured by the shadows of deep hoods or tattered shawls. From a distance, they looked like ordinary townsfolk, perhaps weary, perhaps disinterested in their wares, but as Ethan and Thomas ventured further into the square, it became disturbingly clear that these weren't ordinary people. Master, they're not. Alive, Ethan stammered, unable to tear his gaze away from one of the nearest figures. The vendor's face, now illuminated by a flickering lantern hanging above his stall, was pale, no more than pale. It was translucent, the skin stretched too tightly over the skull beneath, and his eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to swallow the dim light around them. The vendor's lips parted in what should have been a smile, but it was too wide, the teeth jagged and yellowed, as if he hadn't used them in years. Thomas shot Ethan a sharp look. I said, "Don't look at them. Just walk." Ethan swallowed hard, tearing his eyes away from the vendor, but it was too late. His heart pounded in his chest, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. His legs felt heavy, as if they were moving through water, and it took every ounce of willpower to keep following Thomas. The air had grown colder, colder than it should have been for an autumn night, and each breath left Ethan's throat burning with frost. The murmurs began then, soft at first, barely noticeable, but unmistakable. A low, eerie hum that seemed to vibrate through the air. Ethan's ears strained to catch the words, but they were indistinct, an unintelligible drone that seemed to rise and fall with the shifting of the shadows. He turned his head, and as his gaze fell upon the figures moving in the market, he realized that the vendors weren't speaking, they were breathing. Each rasping breath sounded like the hiss of air escaping a dead body, like the final exhale of someone long gone. And yet, the movement of their chests, the rise and fall, was so slow, so irregular, that it couldn't have been natural. It was as if the bodies were being animated by something outside themselves, as if they were merely puppets, their strings pulled by some unseen force. Ethan's blood ran cold. He gripped his dagger tighter, though he knew deep down it would be of little use against whatever horrors this market held. "Master," he whispered, his voice shaking, "what is this place?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. The look on his face, the hard set of his jaw, told Ethan that even he didn't fully understand what they were walking through. "Stay close," Thomas finally said, his voice low, commanding. "And do not stop for anything." They walked deeper into the market, though Ethan could feel every instinct in his body screaming at him to turn and run. He could hear the faint crunch of gravel beneath their boots, the sound far too loud in the eerie silence that hung over the square like a suffocating blanket. And as they moved, the murmur of voices grew louder, clearer. "Fresh meat." Ethan froze. The words weren't a hallucination. They weren't part of the indistinct whispers. They were real, spoken in a rasping, guttural voice. He turned his head slowly, his breath catching in his throat, and saw one of the vendors staring directly at him. The vendor's eyes, those hollow, soulless eyes, locked onto Ethan's, and the crooked grin spread wider, exposing teeth too sharp, too jagged to belong to a human. "Fresh meat," the vendor repeated, its voice like the scraping of bones. "Just for you." Ethan's stomach lurched, bile rising in his throat. He stumbled back, bumping into Thomas, who caught him with a firm hand. "Keep moving," Thomas hissed, his eyes flashing with urgency. Ethan nodded shakily, tearing his gaze away from the vendor, but the damage was done. The market seemed to have come alive now. The vendors, who had once been so still, were moving, their heads turning ever so slowly to follow the two of them as they passed. Their eyes, those dark, empty voids, gleamed with a hunger that Ethan could feel crawling beneath his skin, seeping into his bones. "Fresh meat." The words echoed through the square, spoken by different voices now, each one twisted and broken, each one coming from the mouths of vendors who seemed to have been dead for centuries. Ethan's chest tightened, panic threatening to consume him as the voices grew louder, more insistent. "Master," he choked out. "We have to get out of here." Thomas didn't respond, but Ethan could see the tension in his posture, the way his hand hovered near the hilt of his sword. Thomas was always calm, always composed, but even he was on edge. That terrified Ethan more than anything. They pressed on, weaving through the rows of stalls, their footsteps quickening. The vendors followed them with their eyes, their mouths twitching into grotesque smiles. And then, suddenly, the sound of laughter filled the air. It was the kind of laughter that didn't belong in a place like this, sharp, mocking, and echoing far too loudly in the quiet night. Ethan flinched, his pulse racing as the laughter continued, bouncing off the walls of the nearby buildings, twisting and distorting until it became something monstrous. Fresh meat. For the feast, the laughter stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving behind only the soft sound of Ethan's ragged breathing. He glanced at Thomas, his heart hammering in his chest, but before he could speak, something cold and clammy brushed against his hand. He recoiled with a gasp, looking down to find a long, skeletal hand reaching out from one of the stalls. The vendor, a woman, or what used to be a woman, was leaning forward, her skin stretched taut over her bones, her fingers twisted and gnarled like the branches of a dead tree. "Stay," she whispered, her voice a harsh, rasping sound that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "Stay and feast with us." Her lips cracked into a smile, and Ethan could see her gums blackened and rotting beneath the few remaining teeth she had left. The stench of decay clung to her, thick and pungent, and Ethan gagged, pulling his hand free from her grasp. He stumbled back, nearly falling, his heart racing, his mind screaming at him to run, run, run. But before he could, a voice deeper, more commanding, cut through the chaos. Enough, it was Thomas. His voice rang out, steady and cold, cutting through the suffocating fear that had gripped Ethan. The vendors froze, their movements halting as if held by an invisible force. The market fell silent once more, and for a brief, agonizing moment, nothing moved. Then, without warning, the vendors stepped back, their hollow eyes lowering, their hands retreating to their sides. The marketplace grew still again, the oppressive atmosphere lingering, but the immediate danger seemed to have passed. Thomas placed a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder, guiding him forward. "Let's go," he said quietly, his voice betraying no emotion, though Ethan could sense the urgency in his words. "We've seen enough." Ethan nodded, his legs trembling as they carried him away from the twisted marketplace. The stores faded into the shadows behind them, the vendors disappearing into the gloom as if they had never existed at all. But the voices, the whispers, lingered in the air, clinging to Ethan's thoughts like a dark, festering wound. As they left the square, Ethan cast one last glance over his shoulder, half expecting to see the ghostly figures following them. But the marketplace was gone, swallowed by the night. The streets were empty once more, and the town of Greenshade lay in eerie, oppressive silence. But something told Ethan they hadn't escaped the market. Not really. Part 3. Finding shelter. The market had vanished behind them, swallowed by the darkness of the night, yet the chill of its presence lingered in Ethan's bones. He walked beside Thomas, his breath shallow, his steps shaky as they hurried through the narrow, twisting streets of Greenshade. The weight of what they had just seen pressed heavily on his mind, and though they had escaped the eerie marketplace, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still watching them. Master Ethan's voice trembled as he broke the silence. What was that? Those people, they weren't. Not now, Ethan Thomas interrupted sharply, his voice low but firm. "We need to find shelter." Shelter. The thought sent a wave of relief through Ethan's exhausted body. But as they moved deeper into the village, the oppressive silence of the town settled over them once again. The streets were deserted, the houses dark and unwelcoming. Greenshade felt less like a village and more like a graveyard, a place abandoned by the living, but still teeming with unseen things that moved in the shadows. Thomas stopped abruptly at the entrance to an inn. It was a small, weathered building, its wooden sign creaking in the cold night wind. The faint glow of a lantern flickered in the window, casting long, distorted shadows across the cobblestone street. Ethan's heart leapt at the sight finally. A place to rest, a place away from the horrors of the night. Thomas knocked on the door, his hand firm but controlled, the sound echoing through the stillness like a distant drum. For a moment, nothing happened, and Ethan felt a cold knot of anxiety twist in his stomach. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow sliver of light and a hunched, elderly man peering out. "We need a room," Thomas said, his voice calm but commanding. The old man's milky eyes flickered between Thomas and Ethan, his expression unreadable. For a moment he simply stood there, as if weighing some invisible choice. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "No rooms here." Ethan's heart sank. "Please," he said, stepping forward. "We've been traveling all day. We just need somewhere to stay for the night." The old man's gaze lingered on Ethan for a moment longer, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then, without another word, he slowly closed the door, the heavy thud of the latch falling into place echoing in the night. Thomas cursed under his breath and turned away from the inn, his face a mask of frustration. "Something's wrong here, Ethan." "Stay sharp," Ethan nodded, though his mind was already spinning with fear and exhaustion. They moved on, trying inn after inn, knocking on doors only to be met with the same response: no rooms. Sometimes the innkeepers wouldn't even open the door, their voices muffled from behind locked doors, as if they were afraid to be seen, or worse, afraid of letting something in. The wind howled through the streets, carrying with it a biting cold that gnawed at their skin. Ethan could feel the fatigue setting in, his legs aching, his head heavy with the weight of the night's events. The marketplace, the ghostly figures, the unsettling emptiness of the town, each piece of the puzzle felt more twisted than the last. "Why won't they let us in?" Ethan asked, his voice barely audible. "What are they so afraid of?" Thomas didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned the darkened streets, his senses on high alert. "They know something," he muttered, almost to himself. "Something they're not telling us." The thought sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded, pushed further into the heart of Greenshade, into the dark, where the real terror waited. His mind raced with visions of the marketplace, the twisted faces of the vendors, the way their hollow eyes had followed him. Just as Ethan thought they might be forced to sleep in the streets, they rounded a corner and saw a small light flickering from the window of a nearby shop. The sign above the door was worn and barely legible, but Ethan could just make out the word Butcher. Thomas exchanged a quick glance with Ethan, then approached the door and knocked. This time the door opened almost immediately, and standing in the doorway was a young man, no older than 25, with dark circles under his eyes and a weary expression etched into his face. He looked at them for a moment, his gaze lingering on their travel-worn clothes and the tension that hung between them. "You're not from around here," the butcher said, his voice soft but cautious. "We need a place to stay for the night," Thomas replied, his tone steady but edged with urgency. "No one else will take us in," the butcher hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone or something to be watching. Then, with a sigh, he stepped aside and gestured for them to enter. "Come in," he said quietly. "But keep your voices down." Ethan felt a wave of relief as they stepped into the small, dimly lit shop. The warmth from the hearth hit him like a welcome embrace, and he allowed himself to relax, if only for a moment. The shop smelled faintly of smoke and cured meat, and the walls were lined with various tools of the butcher's trade, knives, hooks, and cleavers that gleamed in the firelight. The butcher led them through the shop and into a small back room where a modest bed and a chair sat near the fire. "It's not much," the butcher said, rubbing the back of his neck, "but you're welcome to it for the night." "It'll do," Thomas said, nodding his thanks. "What's your name?" "Marcus," the butcher replied. "And you?" "I'm Thomas." "This is my apprentice." Ethan nodded in acknowledgement but said nothing. He was too tired, too shaken to speak. Marcus sat down in the chair by the fire, his gaze flickering between Thomas and Ethan with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. After a few moments of silence, he spoke again, his voice low, almost as if he were afraid of being overheard. "You won't find any rooms in town tonight," Marcus said, his eyes dark with something that looked like fear. "Not because they're full, but because no one will risk opening their doors after dark." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Why not?" Marcus's jaw tightened, and he glanced toward the window as if checking to make sure no one was outside. "There are things in Greenshade, things that come out at night. Most of the villagers lock themselves away until dawn." Ethan shuddered. He had felt the unnatural presence in the air, but hearing it confirmed made his skin crawl. "What kind of things?" Thomas asked, his voice steady but sharp. Marcus hesitated, his fingers drumming nervously on the armrest of the chair. "Spirits, demons. I don't know what they are exactly, but they've been here for as long as I can remember. The older folks say the village is cursed. They say it's because of him," who Thomas pressed. Marcus lowered his voice even further, his eyes narrowing with fear. "The Taoist priest. He came here years ago, claiming to be a healer, a man of faith. But since his arrival, strange things have happened. People disappearing, shadows moving through the streets at night, the dead walking." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The dead walking? His mind flashed back to the market, to the vendors whose hollow faces had seemed less human and more like twisted, animated corpses. "The priest," Thomas said, leaning forward slightly, his gaze intense. "Where is he now?" Marcus swallowed hard. "No one knows. Some say he lives in the old temple in the woods. Others say he died years ago, but his spirit never left. All I know is that ever since he came here, Greenshade has never been the same. The villagers, they're too scared to leave, but too scared to stay. So they lock their doors and pray that whatever's out there doesn't find them." Ethan felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was something far darker than he had anticipated. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable as he processed Marcus's words. Then, with a sigh, he stood up and moved toward the window, peering out into the night. "Whatever this Taoist priest is, or what we'll find out. But for now we need rest." Marcus nodded, though his face betrayed his doubt. "Be careful," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Greenshade isn't kind to outsiders." Thomas didn't respond. He remained by the window, his eyes fixed on the dark streets beyond, as if expecting something or someone to appear at any moment. Ethan, too exhausted to think about what might come next, lay down on the bed, his body sinking into the worn mattress. As the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Ethan's eyelids grew heavy and sleep began to pull him under. But even as he drifted into the embrace of unconsciousness, the whispers from the market still echoed in his mind, haunting and insistent. Fresh, meat, and somewhere, far off in the shadows of the night, something was watching, waiting. Part 4. A town in fear. The flames in the hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls of the butcher's modest home. The room was dim, lit only by the firelight, which seemed barely enough to hold back the suffocating darkness that pressed in from outside. Thomas sat near the window, his face grim as he stared out into the night, while Ethan, seated on the edge of the bed, listened intently to Marcus as the young butcher began to speak. The fear in Marcus's eyes was palpable, his voice low and trembling, as though speaking too loudly would summon something from the shadows. Every word was laced with dread, as if the town's dark secrets had been clawing at his throat for years, desperate to escape. Yet now, with Thomas and Nathan here, he seemed unsure whether sharing these horrors would bring him relief or doom. It all started when he came, Marcus said, his eyes darting toward the window, as if expecting to see someone or something lurking just outside. The Taoist priest Ethan frowned, his heart pounding in his chest. The one you mentioned before? The priest who practices dark magic? Marcus nodded, his face pale and drawn. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper, as though the walls themselves were listening. No one knows his real name. He came here many years ago, claiming to be a healer, a man of faith. At first people welcomed him. We had no reason to doubt his intentions. But soon, things began to change. People started disappearing, animals turning up dead in strange ways, twisted, mutilated. He paused, swallowing hard, as if the memory alone was enough to make him sick. Ethan's stomach churned at the thought, his hands gripping the edge of the bed, so tightly his knuckles turned white. Thomas remained still, watching Marcus carefully, his gaze hard and calculating. But it wasn't just the disappearances Marcus continued, his eyes widening with fear. It was the things people started seeing, shadows, shapes in the night. And then, the dead. Walking, Ethan felt a chill crawl down his spine. The marketplace flashed in his mind, the hollow-eyed vendors, their unnatural movements, the rasping breath of those who should have been long dead. Walking, he whispered, his voice barely audible. The dead. Marcus nodded slowly, his face grim. It started small. At first just rumors, people saying they saw their dead relatives standing outside their windows at night, or that they heard voices in the cemetery. But soon there were more sightings. Corpses walking through the streets after dark, wandering aimlessly. Like they were searching for something, or someone. Ethan's heart raced, and he cast a glance toward Thomas, who remained silent, his jaw clenched in thought. There was something in his master's eyes, something that Ethan had never seen before. Was it fear, or something darker, more dangerous? Why didn't anyone do anything, Ethan asked, his voice trembling with disbelief. Why didn't the townspeople fight back? Marcus let out a hollow laugh, one that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. Fight back? You don't fight against the dead, not when they're controlled by someone like him. Marcus's gaze grew distant, his face haunted by memories he could not escape. The Taoist priest, he controls them, he summons them, and those he can't control, he destroys. Thomas finally spoke, his voice calm but laced with a steel edge. What do you mean? Marcus's eyes flicked toward Thomas, his expression darkening. There are creatures in the night, things not entirely human. He creates them, twists them. My brother was attacked by one. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Your brother? Marcus nodded, his lips trembling as he struggled to hold back the fear that gripped him. It was about a year ago. My brother Aaron, he worked as a carpenter. He was strong, confident. He didn't believe in any of the superstitions. He thought all of this talk about the priest, about dark magic, was just nonsense. But one night, he stayed out too late, working on a project outside town. He never came back. Ethan's pulse quickened, his hands trembling. He could feel the horror of what Marcus was about to say creeping toward him, thickening the air in the room, making it hard to breathe. I went looking for him, Marcus continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I found him, or what was left of him. His body was broken, torn apart. But it wasn't just that. His skin, it was covered in webbing, thick, sticky threads that clung to him like a cocoon. Ethan's mouth went dry, his mind racing with the grotesque image Marcus had just painted. Webbing, he echoed, horrified. Like a spider, Marcus nodded, his face pale as death. It wasn't just the webbing, the creature that did it. It was half human, half spider. I saw it. It stood over him, its body twisted and grotesque, with the torso of a man but the legs of a spider, long and jagged. Its eyes were black, soulless. It looked at me, like it was deciding if I was next. A wave of nausea washed over Ethan. He couldn't imagine the terror Marcus must have felt, seeing such a monstrosity, knowing that it had the power to destroy him as easily as it had his brother. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. And the priest is responsible for this, Marcus nodded weakly, his voice cracking with fear. I'm sure of it. The priest. He has a way of controlling things, twisting them. The creature, it wasn't natural. It couldn't have been. Nothing like that exists in the natural world. He made it. He must have. Ethan's mind spun with questions. How could a single man, even a powerful Taoist priest, create such abominations? And why? What was his endgame? But before Ethan could speak, Marcus continued. The villagers. They're too scared to confront him. They know he's behind everything, but no one dares say it out loud. They think that if they ignore it, if they hide behind locked doors at night, they'll be safe. But they're not safe. None of us are. Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of Marcus's words settling heavily on his chest. He glanced toward Thomas, hoping for some reassurance, but his master's face remained cold, his expression unreadable. It was clear that Thomas was already planning their next move, calculating their odds against a force that could raise the dead and create monsters from nightmares. What does he want? Ethan asked, his voice breaking the tense silence. Marcus shook his head, his eyes haunted. No one knows. Some say he's searching for something ancient and powerful. Others say he's just mad that he's lost his soul to the dark magic he practices. But whatever it is, it's only getting worse. Thomas stood up abruptly, his gaze shifting back to the window. We need to find him, Marcus blinked, his expression one of disbelief. Find him? Are you mad? You can't go after him. The things he can do, the things he controls, they'll destroy you. Thomas' eyes narrowed, a fire burning behind them that Ethan had only seen once before. It was the look of a man who had faced death and survived, a man who would not be deterred by fear or superstition. I have faced worse, Thomas said quietly, his voice calm but dangerous. And I won't let him continue to terrorize this town. Marcus shook his head, his hands trembling. You don't understand. He's not just a man anymore. Whatever he's become is beyond anything human. The things he's done, the creatures he's created, they're not from this world. Ethan shuddered, his mind racing with images of the half-human, half-spider creature Marcus had described. The thought of confronting something like that, something that defied all natural laws, filled him with a terror he couldn't shake. Then we need to be careful, Thomas said, his voice cold and calculated. But we can't stand by and do nothing. Ethan swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he stood up beside Thomas. His master's resolve was unbreakable, and though fear gnawed at the edges of Ethan's mind, he knew that wherever Thomas went, he would follow. Marcus looked between them, his face pale with fear and disbelief. You're serious, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You're really going after him? Thomas nodded, his gaze never wavering. We are. For a long moment, the room was silent, the weight of the decision hanging in the air like a suffocating fog. Marcus' hands trembled as he stood, his eyes darting nervously toward the window. If you're going to do this, Marcus said, his voice trembling. "You need to be prepared. The creatures, the dead, they're always watching, always listening. You can't trust the shadows here." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. The shadows. He had felt them creeping at the edges of his vision, moving in the corners of the room like living things. He hadn't wanted to admit it, but now, hearing Marcus say it aloud, the truth settled in his bones like ice. "What should we expect?" Thomas asked, his voice steady as ever. Marcus hesitated, his face pale. "The dead aren't like the ones you've read about in stories. They don't move slowly. They don't stumble around groaning and reaching for you. They're fast, silent. And they hunt in the dark." Ethan's stomach turned. Fast, silent. The image of the dead stalking them in the night sent a wave of nausea through him, but he forced himself to remain calm. Thomas had faced worse, he reminded himself of that. They had faced worse together. "And the creatures?" Thomas asked, his gaze hard. Marcus swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're worse. Some are barely human, others, I don't know what they are anymore, but they're dangerous. You can't fight them like normal beasts. They're smarter, stronger, and they know the town better than anyone." Thomas nodded, his mind already working through the challenges ahead. "Thank you, Marcus. We'll be careful." Marcus stood, his face pale and drawn. "I hope you will be. I don't want to lose anyone else." Ethan could see the pain in Marcus's eyes, the grief that weighed heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just a town in fear, it was a town in mourning, a place that had lost so much to the darkness that now consumed it. As they prepared to leave, Ethan glanced toward the window, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. The night outside seemed darker now, more oppressive. The shadows stretched longer, as though reaching for them, waiting for the moment they stepped outside. "Stay safe," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "And if you see anything strange, don't hesitate. Run." Ethan nodded, though the knot of fear tightening in his chest told him that running might not be enough. Not in a town like Greenshade. Part 5. The hunt for the priest. The wind howled as Thomas and Ethan made their way through the dense, twisted woods that led into the hills. The moon, veiled by thick swirling clouds, barely illuminated the path before them. Each step was a crunch of dead leaves and brittle twigs beneath their boots, but the forest felt suffocating, as if it held its breath, waiting for them to reach their destination. Ethan glanced at Thomas, his master's face carved from stone, determined, yet something darker lurked beneath his expression. Thomas had always been composed, no matter the danger. But tonight, even Ethan could feel the gravity of what lay ahead, the confrontation that would either end the nightmare that gripped the town of Greenshade or consume them both in its dark abyss. "We're close," Thomas muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the dense foliage ahead. The wind seemed to die as they ascended further, and the forest grew unnervingly quiet. Not even the usual hum of insects could be heard. It was as though the very land around them had been infected by the darkness they pursued. Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The story Marcus had told them echoed in his mind, the gruesome image of his brother's mangled body and the half-human, half-spider abomination that had done it. If that was just one of the priest's creations, what else could they expect in the hidden cave? Ethan's heart pounded harder with every step, his breath quickening, but he forced himself to stay focused. Now wasn't the time for fear. They had to find the Taoist priest and stop him. They reached the base of a craggy hill, where the trees thinned out, revealing jagged rocks and an ancient stone path that snaked upward. Thomas halted, motioning for Ethan to stay silent. He pointed ahead to the faint outline of an entrance, a gaping black maw cut into the hillside, the cave. Ethan's pulse quickened. There it was, the hidden cave, where the Taoist priest was said to perform his dark rituals, where he twisted the dead to his will and gave life to monsters that belonged in nightmares. The weight of their task pressed down on him like a stone, but he knew there was no turning back. Thomas turned to Ethan, his eyes hard and cold. "Stay close, no hesitation. If you see anything unnatural, Don't wait to strike, Ethan nodded, swallowing the lump of fear in his throat. He drew his knife, the blade gleaming faintly in the dim light. Its weight felt reassuring in his hand, though he knew it would be little use against whatever horrors waited inside. Still, it was something better than nothing. They approached the entrance cautiously, their footsteps echoing slightly as they stepped onto the stone floor. A cold draft wafted from within, carrying with it the stench of decay. A smell so foul, Ethan had to suppress a gag. The air felt thick, almost heavy, as though it was laden with invisible, malevolent energy. The cave was dark save for a faint, flickering light deeper inside. As they ventured further, the walls grew narrower, the passageway twisting and turning like a snake burrowing through the earth. The light ahead grew brighter, casting strange shadows that danced and writhed along the stone. Every step felt like a step closer to something terrible, something they might not come back from. Ethan's heart raced as they rounded a corner, and the passage opened into a larger chamber. The sight before them stopped him in his tracks. Rows upon rows of corpses stood propped up against the walls of the cave, their faces twisted in silent agony. Their bodies were preserved in some grotesque fashion, their skin leathery and taut, their eyes sunken into their skulls. Some were missing limbs, others had been stitched together, their flesh mangled and discolored as though they had been pieced back together by an unskilled hand. The air reeked of rot, yet these bodies were not decayed, they were trapped in a state of eternal suspension, neither alive nor fully dead. Ethan's stomach churned. He had seen death before, but nothing like this. These weren't just corpses, they were trophies, twisted mockeries of life. Thomas remained eerie calm, his eyes scanning the rows of bodies. "He's been preparing for something," Thomas muttered, his voice a low growl. "A ritual, no doubt." Ethan's gaze was drawn to the far end of the chamber, where the light was strongest. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, stained dark with old blood. Candles flickered around it, their dim light casting an eerie glow on the figure that stood before the altar, his back to them. The Taoist priest. He was draped in long, tattered robes, his hands moving in slow, deliberate motions over the altar as though he was weaving some dark spell. The very air around him seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, warping and twisting with his movements. His presence was suffocating, like a heavy blanket of malevolence draped over the room. Thomas gestured for Ethan to stay behind as he stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The priest, sensing their presence, slowly turned, his face half obscured by the shadow of his hood. But what Ethan could see made his blood run cold. The priest's skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, his eyes hollow and black, like twin voids that seemed to consume the very light around them. His mouth twisted into a cruel smile, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. "You've come," the priest hissed, his voice low and grating, like nails scraping against stone. "I was wondering when you would find me." Thomas' expression didn't waver. He took another step forward, his sword sliding out of its sheath with a soft hiss. "Your time here is over." The priest's smile widened, a sickening chuckle escaping his lips. "Is that what you think? That you can end this?" He gestured to the corpses lining the walls, his eyes gleaming with malevolent glee. "These are but the beginning. My work is far from over." Ethan's grip tightened on his knife. He could feel the dark energy radiating from the priest, filling the room with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. The corpses seemed to shift slightly, their twisted faces turning ever so slowly toward the altar, as though they were watching, waiting. "I've seen enough," Thomas said coldly, his voice like steel. "You've been terrorizing this town for long enough. It ends here." The priest laughed, the sound echoing through the chamber, cold and mocking. "You're a fool," he sneered. "You don't understand the power you're facing. You're just men, bound by the laws of life and death. But I have transcended those limits." He raised his arms, his sleeves falling back to reveal long, gnarled fingers, his nails blackened and sharp. The air around him began to hum with energy, and the room seemed to darken, as though the very shadows were bending to his will. "You think you can stop me?" the priest hissed, his voice rising in a terrible crescendo. Let me show you the true power of the dead. With a sudden motion, the priest slammed his hands onto the altar, and the candles around him flared with unnatural light. The corpses lining the walls twitched violently, their heads snapping toward the altar as though they had been awakened from some terrible slumber. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. The bodies began to move, their joints creaking and popping as they staggered forward, their dead eyes fixed on Thomas and Ethan. A low, guttural moan filled the air, and the room seemed to close in around them, the stench of rotten death overwhelming. Thomas, Ethan shouted, his voice thick with fear. Thomas raised his sword, his eyes fixed on the priest. "Stay close to me," Ethan, he commanded, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. The corpses lurched forward, their movements jerky and unnatural, their mouths hanging open in silent screams. Ethan's mind raced, panic rising in his throat as they closed in. He swung his knife wildly, slashing at the nearest corpse, but his blade barely made a dent in its leathery skin. The thing didn't even flinch, it just kept coming. Thomas moved with precision, his sword slicing through the air, severing limbs and heads with practiced ease. But for every corpse that fell, two more seemed to take its place, their decayed hands reaching out, clawing at the air. The priest watched with a twisted smile, his eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. "You cannot win," he taunted, his voice echoing through the chamber. "The dead do not tire, they do not fear, and they will not stop until you are one of them." Ethan's chest heaved as he fought to keep the corpses at bay, but the sheer number of them was overwhelming. Sweat poured down his face, his muscles burning with the effort of fending off the relentless assault. His knife felt useless in his hand, barely slowing the undead monstrosities that surrounded them. Thomas, Ethan cried out, his voice hoarse with desperation. "There's too many of them." Thomas's gaze flicked toward Ethan, his expression hard. "We're not here to fight them all," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to stop him." He pointed toward the priest, who was still standing at the altar, his hands raised in a mockery of prayer. Ethan's eyes widened. Of course. The priest was the key. Without him, the corpses would fall. But how were they supposed to get to him with the horde of the dead standing in their way? Thomas's jaw clenched. He glanced around the room, his mind working furiously. "Cover me," he commanded, his voice sharp. "I'm going after him." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. But there was no time for doubt. He nodded, tightening his grip on his knife. Thomas didn't hesitate. With a sudden burst of speed, he surged forward, cutting through the corpses with deadly precision. Ethan followed, slashing at any that got too close, trying to keep the path clear for his master. The priest's eyes narrowed as Thomas closed in, his smile fading into a snarl of anger. "You dare challenge me?" He spat, his voice filled with venom. "You are nothing." Thomas lumped toward the altar, his sword raised high. But before he could strike, the priest's hand shot out, dark energy crackling around his fingers. Thomas staggered back, clutching his chest as pain seared through him. Ethan's heart lurched in his chest. "Thomas," he screamed, rushing to his master's side. The priest laughed, his eyes burning with malice. "You are weak," he hissed. "You cannot stop me." "No one can." Thomas gritted his teeth, his face pale with pain, but his eyes remained fixed on the priest, determination burning in them like fire. "I'm not done yet," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. With a sudden motion, Thomas raised his sword again, his movement swift and precise. The blade glowed with a faint, ethereal light as he struck, the energy of the living clashing with the dark power of the priest. The priest screamed, his body convulsing as the blade connected, severing the dark magic that bound him. The corpses around them froze, their twisted faces slackening as the power that had animated them dissipated. Ethan watched in disbelief as the priest collapsed to the ground, his body writhing in agony. The chamber fell deathly silent, the oppressive weight of the dark magic lifting. Thomas lowered his sword, his chest heaving with exertion. He glanced at Ethan, his expression grim but relieved. "It's over," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Ethan's legs wobbled beneath him, his entire body trembling from the fear and adrenaline that coursed through him. He collapsed to his knees, the weight of the ordeal finally crashing down on him. The priest lay still, his body motionless, the dark magic that had once filled the cave now nothing more than a fading memory. But as Ethan caught his breath, a cold realization washed over him. It wasn't over, not yet. Part 6. Confrontation with the priest. The air inside the cave grew thicker, colder, as if the very walls were closing in on them. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes darted across the rows of twisted corpses lining the cave, each one frozen in a grotesque mockery of life. The stillness in the chamber was unnatural, a terrifying calm before the storm. And there, standing at the center of it all, was the Taoist priest. He was cloaked in shadows, his long, tattered robe swaying slightly in the flickering candlelight. His face remained obscured beneath his hood, but his eyes black and gleaming like bottomless pits burned with a malevolent power. His hands moved in slow, deliberate gestures over the stone altar, and with each movement, the oppressive energy in the air seemed to pulse, growing stronger, more sinister. Thomas took a step forward, his grip tightening on the hilt of his sword. "Descends now," he said, his voice sharp and commanding, cutting through the eerie silence. The edge of his blade gleamed in the dim light, ready to strike. The priest slowly turned his head, his twisted smile widening as he regarded Thomas and Ethan. His voice, when he spoke, was a chilling rasp, barely human. "You are too late." Thomas raised his sword, his eyes narrowing. "Stop this madness. You've tormented these people long enough." The priest chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "Madness," he hissed. "You do not understand the power I wield. The dead are mine to command. Life, death, these are but illusions. Soon all will bow before me. You are nothing." Ethan's pulse quickened. He could feel the dark energy radiating from the priest, filling the cave with a malevolent force that twisted the air around them. It felt as though the very ground beneath their feet was vibrating with power. His eyes darted to the corpses lining the walls, still unmoving, but they seemed to loom over them, their lifeless eyes staring, waiting. Thomas took another step forward, his voice cold and unwavering. "I don't care what dark magic you've learned. It ends tonight." But the priest's smile only grew wider, more grotesque. He raised his arms, and the shadows around him seemed to writhe and pulse, as if they were alive. "Fools," he snarled, his voice raising into a terrible crescendo. "You cannot stop what has already begun." Ethan felt his stomach drop as the priest slammed his hands onto the altar with a deafening crack, sending a ripple of dark energy through the chamber. The candles flickered violently, and the air grew thick with an oppressive, suffocating presence. The corpses around them began to stir. Ethan's heart leapt into his throat as the bodies twitched, their limbs jerking and twisting unnaturally. The sound of cracking bones and tearing flesh echoed through the chamber as the dead slowly came to life. Their heads turned, their hollow eyes locking onto Thomas and Ethan with a hunger that made Ethan's skin crawl. Ethan breathed, his voice barely a whisper. His hand shook as he gripped his knife tighter, but the blade felt like a toy in his hand, utterly useless against the horrors that surrounded them. Thomas glanced back at him, his face grim but focused. "Stay close to me," he ordered, his voice calm despite the chaos unfolding around them. The priest raised his arms higher, his voice booming as he chanted in a language that sent a chill straight to Ethan's bones. "Rise, my army," the priest roared, his eyes glowing with a dark, twisted glee. "Rise and destroy them." The dead surged forward. Ethan barely had time to react as the corpses lumped at them, their bony fingers outstretched, their mouths hanging open in silent screams. He swung his knife wildly, slashing at the nearest one, but his blade barely cut through its leathery skin. The creature didn't even flinch, it just kept coming, its cold, dead eyes fixed on him. Thomas moved swiftly, his sword cutting through the air with precision and force. He sliced through one of the corpses, severing its head in a single motion, but for every body that fell, two more seemed to take its place. The dead swarmed them, their movements jerky and unnatural, but they were far faster than any corpse had the right to be. Ethan Thomas shouted, cutting down another corpse as it lunged for him. "We have to get to the priest." Ethan nodded, his throat dry with fear, but the dead blocked their path. There were too many clawing, biting, relentless. His mind raced, panic surging through him as he slashed at another corpse, its decayed flesh tearing beneath his blade. But it wasn't enough. They were being overwhelmed. The priest's laughter echoed through the chamber, cold and mocking. "You cannot win," he sneered, his voice filled with dark satisfaction. "The dead do not tire. They do not fear, and they will not stop until you are one of them." Ethan's chest heaved as he fought to keep the corpses at bay, but the sheer number of them was overwhelming. His muscles burned, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The stench of death filled his lungs, making him gag, but he couldn't stop. Not now, not with the priest so close. Thomas swung his sword with brutal efficiency, cutting through the dead as he pushed forward, his eyes fixed on the priest. "Cover me," he barked, his voice commanding despite the chaos. Ethan didn't hesitate. He fought back the surge of terror that threatened to paralyze him and focused on keeping the dead away from Thomas. He slashed at anything that moved, his knife sinking into rotten flesh, but the dead just kept coming. Thomas pressed forward, his sword gleaming in the candlelight as he struck down the corpses in his path. He was close now, so close. But the priest was waiting, his eyes gleaming with dark amusement. "You are a fool," the priest spat, his voice dripping with malice. "You think you can stop me? I have transcended death itself. You are nothing but an insect to me." With a furious roar, Thomas lunged at the priest, his sword raised high. But before he could strike, the priest's hand shot out, dark energy crackling around his fingers. He struck Thomas in the chest with a blast of raw, malevolent power, sending him flying backward. Ethan screamed as Thomas crashed to the ground, his sword clattering from his hand. The force of the blow had knocked the wind out of him, and for a moment he lay there, gasping for breath. "Thomas!" Ethan cried, his voice thick with fear. He turned, trying to fight his way to his master's side, but the dead swarmed him, their cold, bony fingers clawing at his arms and legs. The priest laughed, the sound echoing through the chamber like the toll of a death knell. "You are weak," he hissed, his voice filled with contempt. "You cannot stop me, no one can." Thomas struggled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, but his eyes were filled with a burning determination. He wasn't finished, not yet. "You're wrong," Thomas growled, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm not done." He reached for his sword, his hand closing around the hilt as he stood, his body trembling with effort. His gaze locked on the priest, and in that moment Ethan saw something in his master's eyes, something fierce, something unbreakable. With a roar of defiance, Thomas charged forward, his sword gleaming with an ethereal light. The priest's smile faltered as Thomas closed in, the dark energy swirling around him. "You cannot stop me," the priest shrieked, his voice rising to a frantic pitch. "I am eternal. I am." Thomas's sword struck the priest's chest, the blade glowing with a pure, white light as it pierced through his robes. The priest let out a strangled scream, his body convulsing as the dark magic that had sustained him began to unravel. The corpses surrounding them froze, their twisted faces slackening as the power that had animated them was severed. The oppressive energy that had filled the cave dissipated, leaving only a cold, empty silence in its wake. Ethan stood there, panting, his knife still clenched in his trembling hand. His body ached, his mind racing to process what had just happened. The priest lay motionless on the ground, his eyes wide and vacant, the last vestiges of his power fading away. Thomas lowered his sword, his chest heaving with exertion. His eyes were hard, his jaw clenched, but there was a quiet relief in his expression. "It's over," Thomas muttered, his voice barely audible. But as Ethan caught his breath, a cold realization washed over him. This wasn't over, not yet. The priest's body twitched. His lips, now pale and cracked, curled into a ghastly grin. His eyes, though empty, glowed faintly with the last flicker of dark energy, and before Ethan or Thomas could react, The priest whispered, his voice barely a rasp. "You think you've won?" With a final, desperate gesture, the priest's hand shot out, slamming against the ground. A deep, guttural chant echoed from his throat, and the cave trembled. And then the dead began to rise again. Part 7. The Battle with the Undead. The cave shuddered as the priest's final, haunting chant reverberated through the air, a low and guttural echo that filled every dark corner. The heavy scent of decay thickened around Thomas and Ethan as they realized, with a growing sense of horror, that the dead were rising again. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he saw the corpses twitch and convulse, their lifeless eyes snapping open, their rotten limbs jerking to unnatural life once more. The eerie silence was shattered by the sickening sound of bones creaking and skin stretching taut over decomposed bodies. Ethan felt the weight of dread pressing against his chest, his heartbeat thunderous in his ears. "They're coming back," Ethan yelled, his voice trembling with fear as he watched the horde of the undead rise, their hollow gazes fixating on him and Thomas with a hunger that sent icy chills down his spine. Thomas' expression darkened, his muscles tensing as he raised his sword. He could feel the oppressive power of the priest's magic growing stronger, the sinister energy pulsing like a living thing inside the cave. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and though his body screamed with exhaustion, he knew they couldn't stop now. The priest lay on the ground, his body broken and twisted, but his malevolent grin remained as his dark magic filled the cave with a terrifying sense of doom. His voice, barely above a whisper, cut through the chaos. "You cannot defeat death, fools. My army will rise again and again, until your bones lie among them." With a snarl, Thomas wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth, his eyes blazing with fury. "We'll see about that." The first wave of corpses surged forward, their ragged, decayed forms moving with a terrifying speed and coordination that no ordinary human should possess. They swarmed toward Thomas and Ethan, their mouths hanging open in silent screams, their hands clawing the air with skeletal fingers. Ethan barely had time to react as a rotting figure lunged at him, its bony hands reaching for his throat. He stumbled back, slashing wildly with his knife, but his blade glanced off its leathery skin. "Damn it," he cursed, panic tightening his chest. His strikes were ineffective, and the sheer number of the undead overwhelmed him. He felt the weight of the horror bearing down on him, threatening to crush his spirit. Thomas, however, was a force of nature. His sword moved with deadly precision, each swing cutting through the undead with lethal efficiency. Heads rolled, limbs were severed, but it was never enough. For every corpse he felled, two more rose in his place, their ghastly faces twisted into expressions of silent torment. Ethan Thomas called out, his voice commanding despite the chaos, "We need fire. Use the talismans." Ethan's heart raced as he fumbled in his satchel, his shaking hands pulling out a handful of sacred talismans, thin strips of parchment inscribed with holy symbols. His fingers trembled as he pressed one of the talismans against the nearest corpse, praying it would work. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden, violent surge of energy, the talisman glowed bright and burst into flames. The corpse let out a horrible, gurgling hiss as the fire consumed it, the flames licking hungrily at its decayed flesh. Within seconds, the creature was reduced to ash. Ethan's breath hitched in relief, but there was no time to celebrate. The undead continued to swarm, relentless and tireless. He slapped more talismans onto the advancing corpses, watching as they ignited one after another, their grotesque forms crumbling to dust in the purifying flames. Thomas fought beside him, his movements sharp and calculated. The sacred talismans were their lifeline, but the sheer number of corpses pressing in on them was suffocating. The cave had become a battleground, a twisted dance of death and survival. The flickering flames of the burning talismans cast eerie shadows on the walls, the flicker of firelight illuminating the nightmarish scene. Despite their efforts, the undead were closing in. Ethan could feel his energy waning, his limbs heavy with exhaustion. "There are too many," he shouted, his voice breaking as he fought to keep the panic from overwhelming him. Thomas didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the priest, who was now sitting up, his face twisted in a manic grin. He had lost control of his body, but his magic was still strong, still feeding the undead with dark power. Thomas knew that as long as the priest lived, the corpses would keep rising. "We need to end him," Thomas growled, cutting through another wave of corpses. "Cover me," Ethan nodded, though fear gnawed at his insides. He had no choice but to trust Thomas. As Thomas charged toward the priest, Ethan turned his attention to the approaching horde, his hands shaking as he lit more talismans, pressing them against the corpses that clawed at him from all sides. The priest's laughter echoed through the cave, a chilling, inhuman sound. "You think you can stop me?" he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "My army is endless." Thomas's face was a mask of determination as he closed the distance between them. The dark energy radiating from the priest was overwhelming, like a black fog choking the air, but Thomas pushed through it, his will unbreakable. Just as he reached the priest, a group of corpses surged in front of him, blocking his path. Their rotting hands reached for him, their hollow eyes filled with the malevolent hunger of the grave. Thomas slashed at them with all his strength, cutting them down, but they kept coming faster and more vicious with every second. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he saw Thomas struggle to break through the wall of undead. His own arms burned with fatigue as he lit another talisman, the fire flickering weakly as it consumed another corpse. They were running out of time. "Thomas!" Ethan shouted, desperation lacing his voice. Thomas's jaw clenched as he fought to keep the corpses at bay. He needed to get to the priest, everything depended on it. But the dead were too many, and he was too far. He could feel the weight of the battle pressing down on him, his body screaming in protest. But there was no retreat. Not now. Suddenly an idea struck Ethan like a bolt of lightning. He rummaged through his satchel, his hands frantically searching for the last of their supplies. His fingers brushed against the cold, smooth surface of a vial, and his eyes lit up with a spark of hope, the holy oil. Without hesitation, Ethan uncorked a vial and hurled it toward Thomas. "Use this," he shouted, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. Thomas caught the vial mid-swing, his eyes widening in understanding. He slashed at the nearest corpse, cutting a path toward the priest. With a swift motion, he poured the holy oil over his blade, the metal gleaming with a bright, ethereal light as it absorbed the sacred substance. The corpses recoiled as Thomas approached, their movements becoming sluggish, their dark power waning in the presence of the blessed oil. Thomas's sword cut through them like butter, the holy light searing through their decayed flesh and reducing them to ashes in seconds. The priest's grin faltered as he watched his army fall, his dark control slipping through his fingers like sand, his eyes once filled with gleeful malice, now burned with fury. "No," he roared, his voice filled with rage. "You will not ruin my plans," but Thomas was already upon him. With a mighty swing, Thomas brought his sword down on the priest's chest, the blade burning with the force of the holy oil. The priest let out a blood-curdling scream as the sword pierced his flesh, the dark magic that sustained him unraveling in a violent explosion of black energy. The corpses surrounding them collapsed, their bodies crumbling to dust as the priest's hold over them was shattered. The cave, once filled with the stench of death and decay, was now eerily silent. Thomas stood over the priest's body, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The priest lay motionless at his feet, his twisted form no longer moving, no longer smiling. The dark magic that had once poured through the cave was gone, leaving behind only the faint glow of the dying talismans. Ethan collapsed to his knees, his body trembling from the ordeal. He stared at the priest's lifeless body, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. They had won. The battle was over. But as the last of the dark energy faded from the air, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this victory had come at a terrible cost. Thomas, still clutching his sword, turned to Ethan, his eyes heavy with the weight of what they had just endured. "It's done," he said, his voice low and strained. "But we need to leave, now." Ethan nodded weakly, pulling himself to his feet. The cave felt oppressive, even in the absence of the dark magic. It was as though the very walls held on to the memories of the horrors they had witnessed. Together, They made their way toward the exit, leaving behind the priest's broken body and the ashes of the dead. But even as they stepped into the cool night air, a sense of unease lingered in the back of Ethan's mind, because something told him that this was not the end. Part 8. Defeating the Taoist priest. The air in the cave had grown thick with malevolence, a palpable, suffocating darkness that made it hard for Thomas and Ethan to breathe. Their bodies ached, fatigue pulling at their muscles, and yet the battle was far from over. The Taoist priest still stood at the heart of the cave, his hands weaving in the air, conjuring an unholy force that seemed to twist reality around them. His mouth moved, chanting ancient words that resonated with unspeakable power. The dead around them continued to rise, and even as Thomas slashed them down, they seemed endless. Ethan stumbled back, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from his chest. His hands trembled as he tried to reload his last talisman, but it slipped through his sweat-slicked fingers. "Thomas," he gasped, his voice breaking with desperation. "We can't hold them off much longer." Thomas's gaze remained locked on the priest, his eyes burning with determination. "There's one way to end this," he said, more to himself than to Ethan, his voice steady but strained. He reached into his coat, pulling out a sacred talisman that glowed faintly in the flickering firelight. Its surface shimmered with an otherworldly power, a relic passed down through generations of demon hunters. This was their last hope, a sacred weapon, imbued with the essence of divine power. The priest's eyes flicked toward Thomas, his lips curling into a twisted smile. "That won't save you," he hissed, his voice like broken glass, sharp and grating. "Your faith is meaningless here." "The dead obey only me." The priest raised his arms higher, his body glowing with a dark energy that pulsed like a living thing. His magic intensified, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The corpses, now numbering in the dozens, swarmed forward again, their soulless eyes fixed on the two men as they advanced with terrifying speed. "Now or never," Thomas muttered, gripping the talisman tightly in his hand. Ethan's voice cracked with fear. "Thomas, what are you going to do?" Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he closed his eyes, focusing every ounce of his will on the talisman in his hand. The relic warmed in his grasp, its sacred energy vibrating through his skin, filling him with a deep, resonant hum. He could feel its power surging, but he knew that using it would come at a great cost. The priest's mocking laughter echoed through the cave, a sound that chilled Ethan to his very core. "You think you can defeat me?" The priest sneered. "I control life and death. The very bones of this world bend to my will. And you are nothing." Thomas opened his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with a quiet, unshakable resolve. "No one is above the divine dot." With that, Thomas raised the talisman high above his head, its glow intensifying until it became blinding. The light burst forth in a radiant arc, illuminating the cave with an ethereal brilliance that cut through the darkness like a blade. The sacred symbols etched into the talisman seemed to come alive, pulsing with an ancient energy that hummed with righteous fury. The priest's eyes widened in shock as the talisman's power surged toward him. "No," he screamed, his voice filled with pure rage. "I am eternal. I command the dead." But it was too late. The light from the talisman struck the priest like a lightning bolt, wrapping around him in a whirlwind of divine energy. His dark robes flared outward as the sacred power tore through him, and the cave filled with the sound of his agonized screams. The shadows that clung to him like a second skin began to disintegrate, unraveling the dark magic that had bound the dead to his will. Thomas and Ethan watched in stunned silence as the priest's body convulsed, his hands clawing at the air in a desperate attempt to hold on to the last remnants of his power. But the talisman's light was relentless, burning away the darkness that had consumed him. The priest's body flickered, fading in and out of existence as his form was torn apart by the sacred energy. No, the priest howled, his voice distorted, growing weaker with every passing second. His face twisted in agony, and for the briefest moment, Ethan saw something human in his expression: fear. The priest collapsed to his knees, his once proud figure now reduced to a withered, broken shell. The dark energy that had swirled around him like a storm began to dissipate, leaving only silence in its wake. The corpses, once animated by his malevolent will, fell to the ground with dull, lifeless thuds. Ethan's chest heaved as he stared at the fallen priest, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The cave, once filled with the stench of death and decay, was now eerily still. The oppressive weight of the priest's dark magic had lifted, and for the first time since they had entered, Ethan could breathe. Is it over? Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. His hand still clutched his dagger, though he was too exhausted to lift it. Thomas stood motionless for a moment, his gaze fixed on the crumpled figure of the priest. The talisman in his hand dimmed, its glow fading as the last of its power was spent. Thomas's face was pale, his body trembling with the effort it had taken to wield the relic. He let out a slow, shaky breath, lowering the talisman to his side. "Sit over," Thomas said, though his voice held a weariness that spoke of the heavy toll the battle had taken on him. He looked down at the priest, who now lay motionless, his once menacing form reduced to nothing more than a frail, hollow shell. "His magic is broken. The dead won't rise again," Ethan exhaled in relief, his legs giving out as he collapsed onto the stone floor. The adrenaline that had fueled him through the battle drained from his body, leaving him weak and shaking. His hands were slick with sweat, his throat dry and raw from the fear that had choked him during the fight. Thomas knelt beside him, his breathing labored but steady. "You did well," Ethan said quietly, placing a reassuring hand on the younger man's shoulder. "We survived." Eden managed a weak smile, though his mind still buzzed with the horror of what they had faced. "I thought we were done for," he admitted, his voice wavering. "That priest, I've never felt anything like that before. The power he had, it was unnatural," Thomas finished for him, his voice heavy with the weight of his own experience. "It's a kind of magic that twists souls, corrupts everything it touches. He had bound himself to the dead, but in the end he was consumed by the very forces he tried to control." Ethan shivered at the thought, glancing toward the lifeless bodies scattered across the cave floor. He couldn't shake the feeling that the priest's presence still lingered, like a shadow that refused to fully dissipate. Thomas stood, though the effort clearly pained him. "We need to leave this place," he said, his voice firm but weary. "The magic may be broken, but there's nothing here for us anymore. We've done what we came to do." Ethan nodded, though his legs still felt like lead. He forced himself to stand, leaning on Thomas for support as they made their way toward the exit. The cave felt cold, desolate, but no longer malevolent. The darkness that had once filled the space seemed to have receded, leaving only an eerie, unnatural quiet. As they stepped into the night air, Ethan took a deep, cleansing breath, grateful for the cool wind that swept over his face. The stars above twinkled faintly, a reminder that the world outside was still turning, still alive. It was a sharp contrast to the death and decay they had left behind. But even as they walked away from the cave, Ethan couldn't shake the sense of unease that clung to him. The priest's final words echoed in his mind, a sinister whisper that refused to be silenced. "I am eternal." Thomas must have sensed his unease, because he glanced over at Ethan, his expression guarded. "What is it?" Ethan hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. What if it's not really over? What if he comes back? Thomas's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening with a grim understanding. "We've severed his connection to the dead," he said slowly. "But the kind of power he wielded, it doesn't just disappear. There may be remnants of it left behind." Ethan swallowed hard, a cold chill running down his spine. "So what do we do?" Thomas's gaze hardened, his grip tightening on the hilt of his sword. "We prepare," he said simply, "and we make sure that if he ever does come back, we'll be ready." As they walked into the darkness, leaving the cave and its horrors behind, Ethan couldn't help but glance back over his shoulder. The entrance to the cave loomed like a mouth, dark and foreboding, as if the very earth itself was hiding secrets far older and far more dangerous than they could ever know. And though the priests had been defeated, Ethan knew, deep down, that their battle was far from over. Part 9. The Aftermath. The first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale light across the landscape as Thomas and Ethan stumbled out of the cave. Their footsteps echoed on the cold stone floor, every movement slow and deliberate, as if the very air around them had grown thick with the weight of what they had endured. The rising sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, but neither of them felt its warmth. The chill of the night still clung to their skin, and the memory of the horrors inside the cave lingered, heavy and suffocating. Thomas paused at the cave's entrance, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. The priest's body was left behind, a twisted, motionless husk on the cave floor, but Thomas knew that they had not truly left the darkness behind. The battle had been won, but something in the air still felt unsettled, unfinished. The sun's light may have pushed back the shadows, but it couldn't shake the feeling that something malignant still lingered just beyond the reach of the dawn. Ethan leaned against a jagged rock, his face pale, his eyes wide with the haunted look of a man who had seen too much. His hand still shook as he wiped the sweat from his brow, his fingers stained with dirt and dry blood. He tried to speak but found no words that could capture the depth of what they had just faced. The silence between them was thick with unspoken fear. The ghostly marketplace, the dark figures, the cursed priest, it all felt like a nightmare. And yet, the pain in Ethan's muscles and the lingering scent of burnt flesh told him it had been horrifyingly real. Is it really over? Ethan's voice finally broke the silence, though it was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon the dead back from the grave. His eyes flicked back toward the cave, as if expecting the twisted form of the Taoist priest to stumble out after them, his dark magic still clinging to his rotted bones. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He stared at the rising sun, its light creeping slowly toward them, casting long shadows across the ground. He could feel the warmth on his face, but it did nothing to melt the cold knot of dread that had taken root in his chest. Over, Thomas repeated, his voice distant, his mind elsewhere. He knew what Ethan wanted to hear, but he couldn't bring himself to lie. No, it's not over. Not really. Ethan frowned, confusion and fear warring on his face. But the priest is dead, isn't he? We saw him fall. His magic. It's broken. Thomas glanced down at the talisman in his hand, now dark and lifeless, his power spent. He had used it to break the priest's hold over the dead, to sever the dark magic that had animated the corpses, but he knew better than to believe that such evil could ever be truly destroyed. Evil like that, it never really dies. It just hides, waiting for the right time to rise again. Ethan shuddered, pulling his coat tighter around himself as the weight of Thomas's words settled over him. He had felt the raw power of the priest's magic, the dark energy that had pulsed through the cave like a living thing. It was ancient, twisted in ways that Ethan couldn't fully comprehend. The thought that something like that could come back stronger, angrier, sent a wave of cold fear coursing through his veins. So what do we do now? Ethan asked, his voice small, uncertain. He had been expecting, hoping for an end, a clean conclusion to the nightmare that had unfolded in Greenshade. But now, standing here in the cold light of dawn, he realized that the fight wasn't over. It never would be. Thomas turned to face him, his eyes weary but resolved. We stay vigilant. We can't let our guard down, not ever. There will always be something else, another dark force, another evil lurking in the shadows. But we're ready. We know what we're up against now. Ethan nodded, though the weight of that knowledge felt like a heavy stone pressing against his chest. He had seen the price of vigilance, a constant battle against forces that defied reason, that threatened to pull him under with their suffocating darkness. It was exhausting, terrifying, but as much as the fear gnawed at him, he knew he couldn't walk away. Not after this. As they began their slow descent down the rocky path, away from the cursed cave, the village of Greenshade came into view in the distance. The once oppressive fog, that had clung to the town like a shroud had lifted, revealing the small, eerie houses nestled among the trees. The ghostly marketplace that had haunted their journey in was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. The strange, hollow-eyed vendors and their grotesque offerings had disappeared with the priest's death, leaving only an empty clearing behind. Ethan stared at the spot where the market had been, his mind reeling with the unreality of it all. "It's just gone," he muttered, more to himself than to Thomas. Thomas nodded grimly. The priest's magic was what kept it there. With him gone, it was bound to fade. "But it doesn't feel right," Ethan continued, his brow furrowing in frustration. "None of this does. How can something so wrong just disappear like that? How can it just vanish as if it was never there?" Thomas sighed, his gaze distant. "Magic like that doesn't follow our rules, Ethan. It doesn't play by the same laws we understand. It's tied to forces older than this land, older than anything we know. When its anchor is broken, it slips away. But that doesn't mean it's gone for good." Ethan clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. "Then what's the point? We kill the priest, we destroy his magic, but we don't even know if it's truly over. How do we fight something that we can't even understand?" Thomas stopped walking, turning to face Ethan, his expression serious. "We fight it the way we always have with everything we've got. We don't stop, we don't give up. Because if we do, if we let our fear control us, then we've already lost." The intensity in Thomas's voice left Ethan speechless. He could see the years of battle etched into Thomas's face, the scars of countless confrontations with the unknown, and the quiet strength that came from facing down horrors that most people couldn't even imagine. This was Thomas's life, his mission, and Ethan realized with a sinking feeling that it was now his life too. The two of them continued walking, their steps heavy but determined. As they approached the outskirts of Greenshade, the village felt strangely quiet, as if it were holding its breath, waiting to see what would come next. The streets, once filled with the unnatural silence of the marketplace, now seemed almost peaceful, though the shadows still stretched long in the early morning light. Ethan looked toward the village, his heart heavy with the knowledge that even though the immediate threat had passed, the darkness would always be there, lurking just out of sight. "Do you think the people of Greenshade will ever know what happened here?" he asked softly. Thomas shook his head. "They'll feel it. Maybe not consciously, but they'll know something changed. They'll feel the weight of what's been lifted, but they won't remember the details. Magic like this has a way of erasing itself from memory, especially for those who weren't directly involved." Ethan frowned. "So they'll just go back to their lives, not knowing how close they came to all of this." "That's the way it works," Thomas replied. "People live their lives unaware of the things that lurk in the dark. It's better that way. If they knew, if they truly understood, they'd never sleep again." The weight of that truth settled over Ethan like a suffocating blanket. He had seen what lay in the shadows, he had faced it, fought it, barely survived it. And now he was supposed to walk back into the light, knowing that it would never truly leave him. It was a heavy burden, one that he wasn't sure he was ready to carry. But as they reached the edge of Greenshade, the sun finally broke fully over the horizon, bathing the village in warm, golden light. For a moment, Ethan allowed himself to feel its warmth, to let the light chase away the lingering darkness that clung to his thoughts. "Maybe one day we'll be able to rest," Ethan said, his voice quiet, almost hopeful. Thomas looked at him, his eyes hard but not unkind. "Maybe," he replied, "but not today." And with that, the two of them left Greenshade behind, the shadows of the past still trailing in their wake, but the light of the new day pushing them forward. The road stretched ahead of them, long and uncertain, but they walked it together, knowing that no matter what came next, they would face it as they always had, with unrelenting determination, and the knowledge that, even in the darkest of places, there was always a way to fight back. But deep down, Thomas knew the truth. Evil, no matter how many times you defeat it, never really dies.